looking forward to the great wonderful lecture. Okay, please, okay. If you cannot express your idea in English, you can speak Chinese. Yes. Okay. Now let's welcome, yes?
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for your very...
My name is Sun Xue from Professor Sun.
I know. Of course I know. We were just at the same conference. Professor Sun was, and I took part in a great conference on U.S. China relations this weekend at China Foreign Affairs University, and he gave a terrific presentation there. And I'm really honored to be here with you tonight, to have a chance to talk about the role that China has played in the United States presidential election. It's a very interesting topic. I think Professor Sun was mentioning that a lot of folks are talking about what impact will the United States election have on China. That's an interesting question. But there's another question, and that is what impact has China had on the United States presidential election? And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about. I've given a number of lectures here in Beijing over the past couple of days. This is actually my 5th lecture in 31 hours. So my voice is a little bit worn out, but I'm going to try to project. And can y'all hear me in the back okay? Good. So first of all, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I have a little bit of a connection to this great university. I was a student at Peking University many years ago, actually just about 24 years ago. And when I was a student at Beida, I had the opportunity to come over and teach English, conversational English, here at Tsinghua University. And so I made a number of good friends here at Tsinghua University, and I had very fond feelings about this, the campus, the school, the students, of course, and the great memories from all those years ago. So when I have a chance to come back now, it means a lot to me at a personal level, and I really appreciate all of you spending the time with me this evening as well. Let me just say what I'd like to talk about tonight is, again, the role and the important role that China has played in the United States presidential election in 2012. And there are a number of different topics that I would like to touch on. And I'll say a few words about each one. By the way, normally when I do a talk, and I'm expecting to speak maybe about an hour, I'll do an outline like this, and I'll write it a few hours beforehand. And typically, for me, a talk would be 1 page, and then the second, and then the third, and the fourth. But because I wanted to tailor this particular presentation for this audience, and not repeat any presentations that I've done before, I tried to make some new notes. But unfortunately, I only got done with the first few lines. But luckily, I know the topic well enough that I think these lines will enable me to speak kind of for about an hour. And then I hope that we'll have perhaps an hour to have your questions and your comments. So let's give it a shot and see how it goes. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is briefly, I'll map out what I want to discuss. The first thing is the history of China in the modern era and its role in U.S. presidential elections. I'll just touch on that because I think it's important to understand the recent history, not 200 years ago, but the last 30 years, to understand the significance of where we are today in U.S.-China relations. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is what I call a challenging and somewhat unprecedented period that we are entering in U.S.-China relations and what that means for China's role in presidential politics and presidential campaigns. So the new challenging period that we're entering, I'll say a few words about that. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about what I call the 3 shifts in how presidential candidates speak about China and think about China. There have been three major changes that make 2012 different from 2008. Very different. And I'll talk about that and give you some interesting details there. Fourth, I want to say a few words about the role of Congress in the context of how we talk about China in U.S. politics. So there's the president, that's one aspect of U.S. politics, but there's also Congress. And Congress's perspective on China is very significant because oftentimes it exerts pressure on presidential candidates and it exerts pressure on the president to do certain things in certain ways. And so I want to talk about Congress. Next, I'll say a few words about how China is factoring into elections, not just for president, but also for other races, including the United States Senate, U.S. Congress, and so on. And I'll give you one example. I'll tell a story about what's happening in Texas that is a very emblematic story about the way that China is becoming an issue, not just for presidential candidates, but also for U.S. Senate candidates and other candidates across the country. After that, I'll say a few words about business and how the U.S. business community looks at China. And then finally, end with an analysis and perhaps a few predictions about what U.S. China policy will look like in 2013 after the election. So that's what I'd like to do. I'll end with a few concluding remarks. And then again, I have the benefit of a clock in front of me, so I'll try to control my comments to run about 50 minutes or so, and that'll give us about an hour so that we can exchange views in a very friendly and candid way. I'd love to hear your observations, and I'd love to hear your comments about what's happening in the United States, and of course your questions as well. So with that, let me just start by talking a little bit about the modern or recent history of how China figures into presidential campaigns. And here I just want to go back to the period of normalization between the United States and China. So the two countries diplomatically recognized each other in 1979. And so the first period in the modern era in which China became a factor in U.S. presidential politics was in 1980. At that time, President Carter was running for re-election. Then Governor Reagan was running against President Carter and challenging him. And one of the issues that came up was the very question of Carter's recognition of the People's Republic of China and derecognition of the Republic of China. Prior to 1979, the United States recognized the Republic of China. And there was a huge shift in 1979, and that became a campaign issue. And from that time on, of course, Reagan went on to win the election, became president for 2 terms, was actually very friendly toward China. And in fact, the 1980s ended up being kind of a honeymoon period in U.S.-China relations. As a matter of fact, I studied at Beida at the end of the 1980s. Some of you, perhaps, were not born yet. Maybe you were 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years old in some cases. But that was a very interesting time and a different time to be a student in China, and it brings back a lot of memories. But it was also sort of the end of the honeymoon between the United States and China that lasted from 1979 to 1989. And I'll talk more about that later. But the point is that from that time on, China became a significant factor in U.S. presidential politics. The next time China really became a big issue was in 1992, which was the first U.S. election after Tiananmen, after the events of 1989 and June 4th. And as a result of what had happened in 1989, Bill Clinton, who was running for president, and George H.W. Bush, who was the president, talked a lot about China, and the discussion was completely about one issue and one issue only, and that was the issue of human rights. So in 1992, when China was mentioned, the word human rights was mentioned in the same sense. And in 1992, when the word human rights was mentioned, the word China was mentioned in the same sentence. The two issues were effectively coterminous or synonymous. And then 96, things were going reasonably well in the relationship. By and large, yes, there were definitely ups and downs in terms of human rights and in terms of Taiwan. But the interesting thing to note is the United States was in a position of great economic strength, and so no one cared too much about China, quite frankly. Things were going well, the American voters and the American people were happy. It didn't come up a lot. In 2000, China came up a little bit in 2004, more in 2008. But it started to shift a little, and I'll talk more about this in a minute. And China started to become a big trade issue for the United States. There were a lot of concerns about trade and the WTO accession and trade practices between the U.S. and China. So these were the kind of things that started factoring in. And now China is being discussed in a different way. But the point that I want to make by talking a little bit about the background, as I have, is that this is not the first year that China has been a significant issue in a presidential campaign. It's basically been an issue to one degree or another degree since the early 1980s. And one might say, well, why is that? And in very broad terms, I think it's possible to say that China is a big, important country that has been growing fast, that has been playing a more and more important role in the world. And it's natural that presidential candidates would talk about a country that's big and important. So it doesn't surprise us that that's the case. Now with that, let me go to the second point, which is the changing environment that we find ourselves in. I think if you were to look at the history of U.S. China relations and sort of analyze the different periods in the relationship, you would find that we are now entering the fifth decade of U.S. China contact in the modern era. I date that back to 1972, when President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China. And at that point, although we did not yet have diplomatic relations, we nonetheless started to have more and more contact. And so dating back to 72, and this is the 40th anniversary year of that visit, which occurred earlier in the year in 72, we can say that there are four distinct periods in the relationship. And interestingly enough, they more or less match up with the 4 decades. So in the 1970s, the United States and China really came together toward the end of the common objective of kind of ganging up against the Soviet Union. The basic idea was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Soviet Union was our enemy in a very real sense. The Soviet Union was certainly not a friend of China's at that time. And so the United States and China made a strategic decision under the leadership of President Nixon and Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai to come together and start to cooperate more in order to gang up against the Soviet Union. The 1980s followed that, and that was the decade immediately after recognition. And so the 1980s were actually a very good time in the U.S.-China relationship. There wasn't an awful lot of controversy. There was some, but nothing like what we have today. And that's because recognition happened in January 1st of 1979. Deng Xiaoping made a historic visit to the United States and was very well received and was very popular among the American people. He wore a cowboy hat in Houston. You remember that great picture? And he formed, the American people formed a positive impression of him, and they started to form a positive impression of China. So we had a honeymoon decade. And then 1989 happened, and the events of June 4th, 1989, which were a real tragedy, and which changed American perceptions of China very dramatically. And that became a very specific point at which we moved into a new phase. And the 1990s, in some ways, were a much more problematic period in the relationship. There was Tiananmen, there was also human rights more generally, and we started to see difficulties emerge for the first time in a fairly serious way on trade issues. And of course, perhaps above all, there were some real controversies surrounding the issue of Taiwan. You may or may not remember, you probably don't remember, but you may have studied, and I was here as a U.S. diplomat at that time. There was a lot of tension around the issue of how the mainland was dealing with Taiwan, the Taiwan presidential election of 1996, Lee Teng-hui's visit to Cornell University, the missile tests, the U.S. aircraft carriers, and the list goes on. But the interesting thing was the relationship between the two countries did not really go off the rails, and very few people in the United States really talked about a China threat. And the reason for that was because the United States was prospering and doing very, very well economically. It was probably the best 10 years or 8 years in American economic history in the modern era. And so the 90s were a time when we started talking more about China's entry into WTO and issues like that. And then 9/11 happened in 2001, and we had counterterrorism as something that joined us all together. I remember after 9/11, President Jiang Zemin, was among the first to call the U.S. President, President George W. Bush, and to extend his condolences over the loss of 3,000 lives, including some Chinese, by the way, and many thousands of Americans, on 9/11 in New York City, in Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. And so the United States and China began working together in a new era with a common objective, what I would call a grand common objective of counterterrorism. And so we actually elevated the relationship to a level of cooperation that we had not seen before. And it was a more or less pretty good time in the relationship. Now that brings me to my point. Today, we're in a challenging and rather unprecedented period of time because we're now entering the 5th decade, and two interesting attributes have come together at the same time in a way that creates some complexity and some challenges. Number one, we don't have a grand common objective like we did in the 70s, in the 80s when we had a honeymoon, in the 90s when things were good in the United States and we were working on some tough issues, in the 2000s, the aughts, when we worked on counterterrorism. Now there isn't any one overarching theme to the relationship. At the same time, that's number one. At the same time, number two, for the first time, the United States is dealing with China from a position and from a psychology of sustained economic weakness. So in the 1990s, we had ups and downs. We had Taiwan, we had human rights, and so on. But it didn't matter that much because the United States was dealing with China from a position of economic strength. So we didn't care. But today, we're dealing with China from a position of relative economic weakness. And so now the China issue matters a lot more. You see how that's changed over the last several decades? That's what's happened. And you have to understand that history to understand where we are now and why Americans' views and perceptions of China have changed. And this is going to lead me into the political issues that we want to talk about, and the campaign issues, and the 3 shifts that I mentioned earlier. But let me make a very important point, and that is, when you're sitting in the United States of America, and you're looking at China through the lens of 4.6 unemployment, 4.6% unemployment, China looks very different than it does if you're looking at China through the lens of 7.8% unemployment. So sometimes Chinese will ask, hey, China's not really doing anything that different than it did before. Why is the United States reacting differently? And the answer to that question, in part, is not because of what China's doing, it's because of what's happening in the United States. That's what really has changed. And so when you look at China and things are going well, unemployment is low, stocks are going up, your net wealth is going up, the value of your home is going up, people have jobs. China's not a big problem. When you look at China and your income is down, your stocks are down, your housing prices are down, you're at record unemployment over a sustained period, China looks more menacing and more threatening from an economic standpoint than it does in the other situation. So that's what's happened, and that's the backdrop against which the United States political leadership, presidential candidates and members of Congress, and even the American people are now starting to look at China, and they're seeing China through that lens. That is a very significant change. And I would argue, I think we're now in a rather unprecedented period, because at the same time we lack a grand common objective, and simultaneously the United States economy is in a very sustained and weak period. You add those two things together and you have a real period of volatility, potentially, in the relationship. So against that backdrop, let me go to the third point and talk about what I would call are the three shifts. Now, a little earlier this year, I gave a talk where I unveiled this idea of the three shifts in American politics, the American politics of China. And that is to say, three shifts or changes in the way that American presidential candidates and political figures think about China, frame China, and talk about China. And I want to share those with you now. And I think having laid out some of the background, you'll be able to see how these things have evolved in recent years. So the first shift that has occurred is that, number one, China used to be, in U.S. presidential politics, a human rights issue. In fact, almost exclusively a human rights issue. Today, it is not at all a human rights issue. There has not been one single word, not one, mentioned in the last 2 years by presidential candidates about Chinese human rights. That's a remarkable change. That's not where we were several years ago, or 10 years ago. But today, it's simply not an issue. Now, what is the issue? So this is the first shift. We've gone from human rights to what? To trade, economics, and national competition. So now when people talk about China, they're talking about China, and I'm talking about presidential candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, and the other candidates who were vying for the Republican nomination as well. When we talk about China, we're not talking about human rights, we're talking about how China is competing with the United States in many different areas. Education. People talk about the fact that Chinese have better test scores than American students. Kids. I mean, President Obama himself has stated that several times, and he worries about it. Very interesting. Energy. The fact that China is producing solar panels and wind turbines, areas that the United States felt that we had a strength in, and we're sensing more competition. Manufacturing, jobs, job creation, science and technology. These are the ways that people are talking about China. And they're talking about China as a national competitor to America. So that's a change from human rights to national competition. Change number two, or shift number two, and this is really interesting, is that China has gone from being it used to be a foreign policy issue. Today, China is not a foreign policy issue. Absolutely not. China is a domestic policy issue in the United States of America. Now that may sound funny. I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
But let me explain what I mean. You can look at a number of different things that have been really remarkable, and I was one of the first people to point this out. I wrote an article about it about a year ago, a little under a year ago. And that is, if you go back to, and this is true for both Democrats and Republicans, by the way. If you go back, let's go back to the root. 2 years ago, the governor of Pennsylvania made an interesting comment about China. You probably didn't see this because you might not have noticed it. It was very specifically made in an American cultural context. There's a thing in America called professional football. And I'm talking about American football, not soccer. Yes, exactly right. And it's my favorite sport, by the way. And there's a professional league, and the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania was hosting, the team there was hosting a team from Minnesota. Very unusual thing happened. There was a blizzard, heavy, heavy snow, terrible storm. And for the first time in many decades, the NFL, the National Football League, had to cancel the game. In my lifetime, no game has ever been canceled. That was the first time. And that was very unusual. What does any of this have to do with China? You may be wondering. So let me tell you. So they canceled the game, and the governor of Pennsylvania said, "We have become a nation of wusses." Does anybody here know what the word wuss means? If you do, raise your hand. So, we've become a nation of wusses. That's slang, American slang, I think, maybe European too, for we're cowards. We've become cowards. Here's what he said. "We have become a nation of wusses. If this were China, do you think they would have canceled the game? No, they wouldn't have canceled the game. They would have had tens of thousands of people marching on the roads, clearing the snow, and doing calculus math problems while they walked." Now, isn't that an interesting thing for an influential governor to say? What does the NFL and the Philadelphia Eagles and Minnesota Vikings have anything to do with China? And yet, the first thing that he said, and he said it on the record, you can go and search for it. He said it because China was on his mind, and we're starting to think of China as a way of kind of measuring our country. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the rhetoric started in 2010, and I'll come back to it and give you another example. But this leads to the third shift. It used to be that presidential candidates would speak about China as a way of using China as a measuring stick for their personal toughness. So I'm going to measure my toughness, my macho-ness, against the measuring stick of China. I'm going to show you, the American voters, how tough I am by speaking tough about China. That's how it used to be. It's still that way to a degree. But what has changed is something now new. Now presidential candidates talk about China as a measuring stick for America's national worth or national adequacy. Instead of measuring the individual against China, we're measuring America against China. China is the standard, and we're asking ourselves, are we the same, or are we better, or are we worse? But every comparison is to China. That has not been the case before. So from measuring stick for personal toughness to measuring stick for national worth, that is a fundamental change. Now let me give you a few examples. The Governor Rendell example that I just mentioned is a good example of how the United States is comparing itself to China on things other than foreign policy, even football. So what the governor was really saying was, China is tougher than us. They would have had this football game, they would have marched and cleared the streets. And it's a comment not about football, but it's a comment about toughness. And that sense of competition, again, is seeping in. But let me give you examples from the two presidential candidates, because this is really remarkable. In early 2012, President Barack Obama gave a State of the Union address, as he does every year, as the U.S. President does every year, typically in January, to both houses of Congress. and he reports to Congress and to the American people how the country is doing. Typically, when a president gives the State of the Union address, which is the biggest speech of the year, once a year in January, he divides the presidential address into two sections: domestic policy and foreign policy. Domestic policy almost always comes first because it's closer to home, and then foreign policy. And President Obama gave the address. What was really remarkable was that in the foreign policy section, China was never mentioned, not even once. But in the domestic policy section, it was mentioned 4 times, more than any other country. Why is that? Because when President Obama was talking about China, he wasn't talking about foreign policy. He was talking about education. He was talking about how Chinese students are doing better than American students. He was talking about energy, clean energy, solar, wind. He was talking about manufacturing. And he was talking about science and technology and innovation. He wasn't talking about foreign policy, he was talking about domestic policy, but he raised China 4 times. If you look back to the presidential State of the Union address in 2011, you see a similar dynamic, but it's even more pronounced this year. This, I think, is the first time that we've seen, the first presidency that we've seen, in which a president has talked about China, but not talked about China as a foreign policy issue. So that's a very significant example of the change that I was talking about. But it's not just on the Democratic side. It's also on the Republican side. Let me give you 2 examples that are very interesting. First of all, as you know, we have an incumbent president, Obama, so he was not challenged from anyone within the Democratic Party. But on the Republican side, there was a contest in order to get the nomination for the Republican Party. And there were about 9 Republicans who were running against each other, including 1 woman and 8 men. And one by one, they finally were knocked out by Romney, who did a good job, and he won the nomination. During the course of that 1.5 years of campaigning, the presidential candidates in the Republican Party, who were competing for the Republican nomination, debated about 24 times. So they stood on the same stage, 7, 8, 9, 7, 8, finally 5, then 4, and it got smaller as people got knocked out. And they debated about all kinds of issues. Approximately 6 or 7 of those debates, about 1/4 of them, were about foreign policy. Interesting piece of news. China was never mentioned in any of those debates. Isn't that weird? Strange. China is the #2 economy in the world. It's a huge power. It's growing in strength. It has a large military. It's a United Nations permanent member of the Security Council. It's a critical player in regional and world affairs. And not once did any presidential candidate mention China in any of the 6 foreign policy debates. Isn't that weird? It's strange. It's the first time we've ever seen that. Yeah?
I have a question.
Yeah.
During the Cold War era, did they do that to Soviet Union as well? They talk about Soviet Union in foreign policy part or domestic policy part?
Foreign policy.
So
Yeah.
that's
strange. It's a big difference. Good question. So yes, when the Soviet Union existed, the Soviet Union was the existential foreign policy and military threat. We didn't compare ourselves to the Soviet economy because the Soviet economy was terrible. We were killing the Soviet economy. What we cared about was 10,000 nuclear missiles pointed at us. And the proxy wars in various parts of Africa and Asia and in South Asia and Afghanistan. So Soviet Union was a foreign policy issue. And it was an existential issue, but not a domestic
But
policy
they were
issue.
doing great in terms of scientific technology and
Well,
education, something like that.
They did well in certain sectors of scientific advancement, including space, but they didn't do well in many other areas, and that's why the Soviet Union doesn't exist today. If they had been doing very well, they'd still be here. You're welcome. Good question. Thank you for your question. So the point that I'm making is, those debates are emblematic of what's happened. China's not foreign policy. Let me give you another example. Governor Mitt Romney. Governor Romney said something that, in my opinion, is probably one of the most interesting comments ever made by a presidential candidate about China. Maybe it's the most interesting, actually, in my opinion. I don't know if you've heard this, but if you haven't, you should. And so I'll tell it to you. Earlier this spring, and then later again this month, he said the following, and these are very close to his words. He said, if I'm elected president, I'm going to look at the U.S. federal budget, and I'm going to look at the money that we spend, and I'm going to ask myself one question, and that is this spending priority important enough to borrow money from China? And if it is, we'll do it. And if it's not, we won't. Now, think about the implications of that statement. Think about what that means. The U.S. federal budget is about $4 trillion. Now, we actually take in about $3 trillion or so in tax revenues. That means we have about $1 trillion a year deficit. We also have a very large national debt. And so Governor Romney is saying he is going to judge every single dollar of American federal spending against the China test. Is it important enough to borrow from China or not? That puts China, according to Governor Romney, at the center of every single decision that the president makes on every program in the United States of America. Military, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, energy, education, health, and the list goes on. We only do it if it's worth borrowing from China. That is an incredible statement. I think it's the most incredible statement I have ever heard about China mentioned by a major party U.S. presidential candidate. But it shows you, again, how deeply China has gotten under the skin of the United States, and how deeply it has become embedded in the American psyche, and how concerned Americans are about China's role in the United States and in our future. So those are some of the things that have happened, and it gives you a sense for what has really changed in the way that the United States talks about China. The other thing that I think is really worth mentioning is, and this is worth, I think, highlighting, the year 2012 is a very unusual year. The year 2012 has had a bunch of elections, as we know, and also transitions. Of course, the 18th Party Congress is happening next week, and it happens begins 2 days after our election. But it's also important to note, if you take a step back, that when you think about it, U.S. presidential elections and Chinese party congresses rarely coincide in the same year. It happens exactly once every 20 years. And that's because the United States is on a 4-year cycle and China is on a 5-year cycle. The last time this happened was 1992. The next time it will happen is 2032. But this year it's happening. And the interesting thing also is that the last time it happened, China didn't really have a transition because Jiang Zemin was the leader before the 92 Party Congress, and he remained the leader after the 1992 Party Congress. So there wasn't really a significant transition in China. This year, there will be a significant transition of the top leaders, and we'll see that next week. Meanwhile, the United States has its presidential election next week, and so for the first time in the history of U.S. China relations, both countries are either having a transition or a possible transition at the same time. And the implication of that is that political pressures are being brought to bear on the leaderships of both countries at the same time in a way that has never been the case before. And so this has been a remarkable and unusual year with respect to the timing of all these elections and with respect to how China has come to be more and more central to our politics, and arguably the United States becomes very important and continues to be important to China as a country, and in certain ways perhaps to Chinese politics. So I think those are the main points that I want to make about the three shifts that have occurred. And the last thing that I would say before moving to the role of Congress briefly is that what you see now in the campaign currently is a lot of advertising that starts to talk about China. So you have President Obama, you have Governor Romney, they're fighting each other. If you happen to live in a swing state, which is one of the states that could go either way, it's very close, such as Ohio, Virginia, Florida, perhaps Iowa, Colorado, and arguably one or two other states. If you happen to live in one of those states, let's say you come home after work, you turn your television on about 7 o'clock, you watch TV until 11 or 12, let's just say, you're going to see about 70 or 80 or 90 political ads on television, with Obama blasting Romney, and with Romney blasting Obama. Again and again and again, and you see it, many different commercials, not the same commercial. A whole bunch of them. And if you're in a swing state, you're seeing all of them. If you're in Texas, you're not seeing them, because Texas is going to vote for Romney, there's no question. If you're living in California or New York, you're not going to see the ads because New York will vote for Obama. But if you live in a place it's closely contested, you're going to see these ads. And I'm seeing them because I have a home in Virginia. And so you get to know these guys really well, and you hear their voice. Under U.S. law, passed some years ago, but not too long ago, a law was passed that says that when you have an ad, you must say the following sentence: I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message. Or, I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message. The reason, by the way, that that law was passed was so that you force the candidate to take personal responsibility for what is in that message. Because some of these messages are ugly and nasty and very, very tough and hard-hitting. But in fact, one time recently, Obama made a joke in a speech. He said, I think all of you must be very tired of hearing me say that, right? And everybody said, yes, we are. But that's how it goes. And so you see a lot of ads. China is figuring prominently in those ads. So Obama is hitting Romney by saying that Romney outsourced a lot of jobs when he was in the private sector from America to China. And Romney is hitting Obama by saying that Obama has been too soft on China. So they're both killing each other on China. And this has been manifesting itself now for some weeks. It wasn't manifesting itself much some months ago, but it is an important part of the campaign right now. Now, with that, let me segue into the issue of Congress. We've been talking about the presidential campaign, but every 2 years, all members of the House of Representatives have to run for re-election or election. And 1/3 of the members of the United States Senate have to run every 2 years because they have 6-year terms that are staggered. So, in addition to the election for president and vice president, the fact is there are a lot of folks running for office all across the country, for Senate, for Congress, for governor, for state legislatures, and other offices. So it's not just the president when we talk about how China is figuring into the politics and into the election season of the United States. Congress has recently taken a much more active role in raising issues related to China. And there are a couple of examples that I could give. But I would say that as a general point, congressional sentiment regarding China has become somewhat tougher. And Congress is very important in American politics. Congress is not a rubber stamp legislature. Congress has enormous power. It has, as we say, the power of the purse. It controls the budget. Obama can only spend money that the Congress gives him. And he can also borrow money that we don't have, and that's what happens in terms of our federal deficits. But nonetheless, even the Congress has to control the debt ceiling. So the bottom line is Congress plays a very important role. Sentiment in Congress toward China is becoming more and more negative. Principally, the issue is trade. Because every congressman worries about jobs in his or her district. That's really what they care about. They may care about the nation, but they really care about their congressional district because every member of Congress represents about 700,000 people. And he or she cares about jobs and how people are doing. And if people aren't doing well, they're going to tell the congressman and want the congressman and expect the congressman to do something about it. And so trade has become a very serious problem. The serious concerns that Congress has about trade with respect to China fall into probably three major categories. Number one, there's a lot of concern about the Chinese currency, the renminbi. You know that, you've read that. You've also heard that Romney has said that if he becomes president on the first day, he will label China a currency manipulator. Now, we'll talk about that more later. But there's a lot of sentiment in Congress, not just among Republicans, but also among Democrats, as to the sense that the currency is still not properly valued. Now, the fact is, the Chinese renminbi the Chinese yuan has in fact appreciated 25 or 30% in recent years. That's a statistical fact. But there is a sense that it's not quite enough. One can debate, is that correct? Is that not correct? Some ways it's a matter of opinion. And there are those in the United States who hold that view. But the fact is Congress is focused on that, and they have put forward legislation, proposed legislation, it has not passed yet, that would put pressure on China to make China appreciate the currency even more. That's one issue. Another issue that Congress is very concerned about is intellectual property rights. And let's be honest, China's record on protecting intellectual property rights is poor. It's just not a good record. There's no question about it. I worked on this issue, and many of us know that there are still very serious problems. Is it a little better than it was 15 years ago? Yeah, I think so. Is it much better? No, it's not. And American companies are losing billions and billions of dollars every year. That really is a fact. It's not even debatable. Even Chinese will acknowledge that. And they say, well, the issue is enforcement, and it's tough to enforce because there's a lot of jobs at stake, and we try to enforce, but then the governors or the mayors don't support us, and so forth and so on. But the bottom line is it's still a problem. It's costing billions, and it's costing jobs. And so Congress and the President and Mitt Romney and a lot of people are very upset about it. I'll come back to the business perspective in a minute, but that's another big issue. And then there's a third issue that's popped up in Congress in terms of China and American politics. And that's the issue of Chinese telecommunications companies trying to enter the United States market. You may know that the company Huawei and ZTE or Zhongxin was trying to enter the United States. These companies do in fact do business in the United States. In the case of Huawei, they have 1,700 employees in America. Their headquarters are in my beloved home state of Texas. They have offices in 12 or 13 other cities. And they do about $1.5 billion of business in the United States every year. But they want to do more. And ZTE wants to do more as well. You may be aware that there was a very high-profile hearing in the United States Congress before the House Select Committee on Intelligence. And that's a very important and influential committee in the United States House of Representatives. And they held a hearing and invited high-level officials from Huawei and ZTE to testify. And basically the result of the hearing was that this congressional committee came to the conclusion that Huawei and ZTE pose a national security threat to America, and we must not allow them to come into the country and do more business. They're already doing some business, more than $1 billion. But Congress said, and you can agree or you can disagree, it's a matter of opinion, but Congress's opinion, the committee's opinion, was we have to shut this down, and we're asking the U.S. executive branch, basically ultimately the president, to say no to any further investments in the telecommunications sector in the United States. So this is a serious issue, and it happened right before the election, and it raised the profile of these companies in a negative way, and highlights the problems of trade in the relationship. So in all of these ways, Congress is becoming somewhat more negative on China because they're feeling pressure from their constituents that there are real problems in the relationship. And that leads me to the issue of business. Interestingly enough, one of the real positive forces in U.S. China relations on the U.S. side for the last 30 years has been the U.S. business community. The U.S. business community has been very pro-China, very pro-China. And they've said, and they've pushed hard, presidents and senators and governors and others, we need to do more business with China, we need to open up to China, we need China to open up to us. We have to engage, we have to work together. Our profits depend on it, our shareholders expect us to exploit this market, to enter the market, to do business, to sell high-quality goods, and to make a good return on our investment. And so business has pressured presidents again and again and again to have a positive U.S.-China relationship. That is beginning to change, and that has an impact on politics. It's beginning to change because after many years of trying to get access to this market and to get their intellectual property protected and to compete on a level playing field with Chinese companies, many important American businesses are beginning to conclude it's just not working. It's not working as well as it should. We're encountering problems that we shouldn't be encountering in the year 2012. This isn't 1992. This is 2012. And there's still limitations on market access. There's huge issues with intellectual property. And there's also issues with subsidies and indigenous innovation, where Chinese public policy favors domestic companies over foreign companies, and a lot of other restrictions that are out there. So, for the first time in the modern history of U.S.-China relations, since normalization, the business community is beginning to sour on China. And that means, if you think of it this way, historically, the business community was, let's say you have a ship on the high seas, you're going through rough waters. The business community was the ballast, the heavy stuff that you put at the bottom of the ship to stabilize the ship during the rough waters. It was the ballast that stabilized the ship and pushed U.S.-China relations forward. That ballast is beginning to disappear. And now the business community is saying, you know what, we've tried and tried and tried and it's not working. And they're very frustrated. And that's not a good thing for U.S. politics and for China's role specifically in U.S. politics, because it means that China's biggest ally of the last 30 years, the U.S. business community, is basically saying, we're done. That's a problem. So that's something we can talk about some more. The final thing I want to say, and I'm cognizant of the time, I want to end a little after 8 o'clock, is that with all of these considerations, having talked about the president, the presidential campaign, the two candidates, having talked about the shifts that have occurred, having talked about Congress, the states. Actually, I want to give one more example. Let me give one example of how China is playing out in the states, by the way, before I forget, and before I shift to looking ahead to 2013. This is worth mentioning because it's an interesting case. I mentioned that not only is China playing a role in the presidential election per se, it's also seeping down into, or trickling down, if I can use that phrase, into more local politics. Let me give you one case from the state of Texas, which is my home state. And it was very interesting the way China came into this. There was a primary election to fill a Senate seat, a U.S. Senate seat, that was becoming vacated by an outgoing U.S. senator. So there's a senator from Texas, one of two, who's leaving at the end of her term, Kay Bailey Hutchinson. And so a number of Republicans and Democrats decided to run for that seat. And in the Republican primaries, there were a number of candidates, but two emerged. And one was seen as the favorite to win this race. And that was the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, the number 2 political figure in Texas, and that was a guy named David Dewhurst. And very wealthy man, very successful politician, longtime lieutenant governor, the number 2 to the governor, very natural candidate for the Senate seat representing Texas. So he already represents all of Texas as lieutenant governor. It's not a big stretch to become the senator and represent all of Texas in the United States Senate. So he was seen as the front-running candidate. But interestingly enough, there was a guy named Ted Cruz, C-R-U-Z. Ted Cruz is a name you should remember because he may run for president in a few years. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But Ted Cruz kind of came out of nowhere. He's a Cuban-American man. He's a little over 40. He's about 41 or 42 years old. He's a very smart guy, a lawyer, has a Harvard Law degree, and has argued successfully before the United States Supreme Court. And he said, you know what, I'm going to run for this Senate seat, for the Republican nomination for the Senate. And he challenged Dewhurst. Some months ago, nobody in the world thought that Ted Cruz could win this election, because Ted Cruz represented and represents what we call the Tea Party. Have you heard of that?
Tea Party.
And the Tea Party is a very extreme form of Republican conservatism that talks about the importance of the Constitution and really slashing spending and basically having an extremely limited approach to government. And so he started his campaign, he went around the state, and day by day, week by week, he built up support from the grassroots. And in the primary election, he managed to do something no one thought was possible. He stopped David Dewhurst from getting more than 50% of the election, 50% of the vote. And that meant that David Dewhurst and Ted Cruz had to go, who were number 1 and number 2, and there were others who were 3, 4, 5, and so on. Those two had to go into a runoff, into another election to decide who the winner was. And in that runoff election, Ted Cruz defeated David Dewhurst. Now, why do I mention this? Because David Dewhurst attempted to attack Ted Cruz with a vigor and, quite frankly, a nastiness that I have rarely seen in U.S. politics, and I've seen some nasty races. But he went after Cruz viciously. And more than anything, he went after Cruz on China. And he said that Ted Cruz was soft on China, and he said that Ted Cruz valued, as a corporate lawyer, profits from China more than he valued Americans. So basically, Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst said Ted Cruz liked China more than America. And he slammed him again and again, and he even did the following. David Dewhurst created a website called therealtedcruz.com. And so when people looked up Ted Cruz, they would see the website and they would say, oh, the real Ted Cruz? Yeah, I'd like to know the real Ted Cruz. And the whole website was about one thing: how Ted Cruz loved China more than America. Now the interesting thing，很久，能不能回答这样的一个问题？为什么很多美国人感觉到中国好像不是一个自由的国家？然后这种事情发生，我怎么回答？对，所以我觉得影响还是比较大。那么所有的人可以有他们的看法。但是我觉得中国的领导层也好，或者是老百姓也好，必须意识到和了解到，如果中国政府的确用这样的比较强硬的方式表达他们的不满，然后甚至于不允许老百姓上网找到《纽约时报》的网站，这个也会有一个后果，也会有一种恶性循环，然后让更多的美国人感觉到，哎，你看，果然中国就是这样的一个国家。所以我觉得。从这样的一个角度来看，我自己感觉到，代表个人，不代表其他的人，就是中国政府这样做不是很明智的，那是我的看法。可能你的看法不一样，可能他们的看法还有各种各样的不同的看法。但是我觉得这样的做呢，是一种，好像看得不太远的一种行为，因为归根结底，实际上中国的读者，中国的老百姓。会得到这个信息，反而唯一的吃亏的就是中国和中国的形象。所以基本上，我觉得我关于你第一个问题的回答可能就到此结束。第二个呢，我就用英文讲。With respect to the question of the renminbi, which I know that you're passionate about, you know, a currency's evaluation is. 其实我觉得现在我跟大家讲一下，就是我一开始滔滔不绝的用中文讲话，我都觉得就是回到英文的时候，我觉得很奇怪。我也越来越觉得现在觉得感觉很独特。不过我还是坚持用我的英文来练一练我的英文。我还是用英文。The renminbi is, in some ways, it's a domestic issue for China. Of course, it's your currency. I get that. But let's be honest, it also has an impact on the United States. And so it's very natural for the United States to say, here's what our opinion is. If you want to appreciate the currency, do it. If you don't want to, don't do it. That's your decision as a nation. But the United States is entitled to its opinion. And you're entitled to your opinion. Nobody can force China to do something that China doesn't want to do. That's fine. That's the way life is. But at the same time, it's not wrong for American elected officials to express their views about the renminbi or any other issue, because they have the right to express those opinions. So, you know, is there an issue there? There has been improvement. We have seen appreciation, 25, 30%, I think, in the last several years. Is there still some room to go? Probably, but I don't know. I'm not a trained economist that looks at these issues with technical expertise. But has it gotten better? Yes, of course. Is it something that could get better still? Perhaps so. But there's nothing wrong with somebody expressing their viewpoint about it. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with any of you expressing your criticism of the United States. We live in a free world. Have fun. Say whatever you want. It doesn't bother me. You're entitled to your opinions. And Chinese leaders are entitled to their opinions, and American leaders are entitled to theirs too. Does that answer your question?
但是我想说的是，就是在中美贸易问题上，很多的时候，美国这样的处理，比如说，前两天出现的那种反倾销对中国的是离他人的反倾销活动，我记不太清楚。
Yeah, and tires too.
就是那个事情的时候，很多的时候，比如说我国内的，中国国内的这些企业，它会面临着一个问题，它到底要不要向美国去出口这些比美国公司所 产的那些产品要低廉的一些价格，它会面临着这种反倾销，反倾销给它的生产压力带来的是很大的。而在美国国内，同样的这样的企业，当美国对中国反倾销的时候，他们的竞争也会变大。这样的话，就是属于美国政府做了一个决定，是既不利于中美贸易友好关系，也不利于美国政府之间的那个它本土的这些经济企业。
Let me just say, President Obama has brought a number of trade cases against China in the WTO. And he's won all of them that have been decided. The WTO made a judgment that the United States was right and China was wrong in those particular cases. That's a matter of record. That's a matter of factual record that you can check on the WTO website. So the fact is, a neutral party, the WTO, actually found that the United States case had merit in 7 or 8 or 9 of these trade cases that have been brought. If that's the case, then what we can conclude is that in those cases, the U.S. was right, China was wrong, the WTO decided, and the matter has been resolved. I don't have an issue with that. Sometimes the U.S. may bring a case and we may lose. That's okay too. But it's ultimately up to the WTO authorities to make those judgments. We're a WTO member, you're a WTO member, and so we all agreed to abide by those rules, and that's what we're doing. So I don't have an issue with that. Let the system work. We don't always agree. When we don't agree, there are mechanisms to solve those disagreements, and the mechanisms generally work, and then we have to obey the rules. So to me, that's a very normal outcome. You mentioned the anti-dumping cases with respect to the various issues of car parts, tires, and so on. There's a system in place to deal with that, and I think it's working pretty well. And I think there's a concern that China doesn't always follow the rules. But the good news is that we have a system that allows those questions to be resolved by a neutral third party. And I think that's a positive thing for both countries. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hey, I have 2 questions too. First, would you like to give your comment on the statement claimed by both President Obama and Governor Romney, that is, China is an important partner in trade, but China has to play by the rule.
Yeah.
So would you like to give your comment on this statement?
Sure. China is an important partner. U.S. China trade is about $500 billion a year, more than any other 2 countries except maybe the U.S. and Canada. But basically it's one of the largest, by volume, one of the largest trading relationships in the world, and will probably become #1. These are the #1 and 2 economies. We have to work together. We depend on each other. But there is a concern in the United States that in a number of important ways, China doesn't do what it has said it would do. The issue, just to be very clear, is not that China doesn't play by U.S. rules. That's not the issue. The issue is whether China plays by the rules that it itself has accepted. WTO, its own IPR protection, intellectual rights protection laws, and the list goes on. And quite frankly, there's a record. We don't have to guess about a lot of these things. Just looking at the issue of IPR alone, the fact of the matter is China has not protected intellectual property rights in accordance with its own laws in many years. Nobody can seriously dispute that. Most people in China don't dispute that. They try to explain why that is so, but they don't disagree with that conclusion. But the fact is that costs a lot of jobs and it costs a lot of money in terms of lost profits for U.S. companies. So China does need to play by the rules just the same way that the United States needs to. No country is perfect. The United States has made many mistakes in its history as a nation. China's made its own mistakes. Most countries have. These are not huge things, but they're important because they mean jobs, they mean employment, they mean prosperity. And there's a sense, this is not war and peace, but it is a very important principle of getting along in the world today, that you have to ultimately embrace and accept the rule set that you signed up to accept when you acceded into WTO in 2001 or in other contexts. And I think it's not unfair for U.S. observers to observe, to comment, and to conclude that China hasn't always done that. And I think the thing that we have to get beyond, both of our nations and peoples, is you've got to be able to disagree without demonizing the other one. Right? Would you agree with that? We've got to be able to say, you know what? I disagree with you, but you're a good person. You're a nice guy, and it's nothing personal. I just have a different point of view. And we have to be able to do that as nations. And I think what happens too often here, and also in the United States, but make no mistake, it does happen here too, is that instead of simply disagreeing, we then demonize the other one. And we think the worst about the other one. And one of the things that I've come in my old age, I have a lot of gray hairs, and I've kind of come to some wisdom over the years. And that is, it's not personal, it's business. And, we don't always have to agree, but what we need to do is manage our disagreements in a way that is mature and constructive, because our two nations have to deal with each other very intensively and very constructively to be able to achieve both of our nations' national interests. And so I think that's a broad lesson that we just need to get better about on both sides. And I think slowly but surely we're getting there.
Yeah, okay. My second question is that since by now this election has been a very close one, and what do you think if the following situation should happen? First is that Mitt Romney is more popular than Barack Obama, but he still loses the election.
Yeah.
And the second is that their election is so close that we have to leave the Congress to decide which one will be the president.
Ooh, those are good questions. So, let me just say one word of background, because you obviously know the system well, but maybe not everybody does. So, in the United States, the vote for president is not a national vote. It's state by state. The national vote number doesn't matter. What matters is whether you win states and win electoral votes. There's an electoral college, and each state has a number of electors proportionate to its population. California has many, Texas has many, North Dakota and Rhode Island have few, etc. And you can look at those numbers. There are a total of 538 electoral votes. 538 electoral votes. To win the presidency, you have to win the majority of electoral votes. That is 270. 269 would be half and half. So 270 is what you need to win. And there is a possibility that one candidate in this close race could win the popular vote, but not win the electoral college vote. That's what happened in 2000 with Bush and Gore. And that was not a pleasant thing for Americans, but our Constitution is very clear. Bush received but 600,000 fewer votes than Al Gore, which was actually only a fraction of a percent, compared to the many tens of millions that were cast. But Bush won the presidency, even though he had fewer popular votes. Could that happen again in 2012? Possibly. If we actually get, you also asked, what if we get an electoral college tie? What if we get 269 to 269? What do we do then? Do we have two presidents? No, that wouldn't work very well, because these guys don't like each other very much. But what we would then do is, according to the Constitution, which is very clear. By the way, the Constitution is a brilliant document. They thought of every possible scenario. I mean, it really is absolutely amazing. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Anything in 2012 that we can think of in the 1780s, they already thought of. And that's pretty remarkable. But the Constitution says if it's a tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. and then the new House of Representatives in January, after the election, votes by state. And so you could have a scenario where, so there are more Republican members of the House of Representatives in the state of Texas, so the Republicans are more than Democrats, so Texas becomes one vote for Romney. There are more Democrats than Republicans in California, so California becomes one vote for Obama. There's 50 states. So you go through and someone has to get 26 votes. Then it raises a question, what if you have 25 to 25? But I don't think that's going to happen. The fact is, sooner or later in the Republican-controlled House, I think you get a Romney win. So if it's a tie, I think Romney becomes the next president. I don't think it's going to be a tie, but it could be. It is possible mathematically. There are different scenarios that really could happen. It's also possible that we have a split electoral college popular vote scenario. And if that happens, two things. One, whoever wins the electoral college becomes the president of the United States. That might be Obama. And it might be that possibly, according to some national polls, Romney may, I don't think this is right, but there are polls that show he may win the popular national vote, but he still may not win the electoral college. In that scenario, Obama would continue to be president. Open, shut case. That's it. But the last point I would make is, if this happens, I think that we will probably see finally a successful effort in America to change the United States Constitution and to have a national popular vote for president. Because if this happens twice in 12 years, when it had only happened once in 200 years before, and it becomes, quote, the new normal in U.S. politics, that is not going to be acceptable to the American people. And I think we may finally see the amendment that many of us would like to see with respect to a direct national popular vote for president. Whoever wins one more vote wins. That's like it is in France. It's like it is in many other democracies. And it really is the democratic way to do it. So let's watch what happens and we'll see. Let's go over here and then we'll come over to you. Yes, sir.
非常感谢。我是来自中国青年政治学院的，然后今天我来是带了3个问题想请教您，然后希望您能够用中文来回答我。第一个问题是，美国现在正在进行总统大选，然后我的问题是，在美国的，就是在美国的宪法的制定者，他们在制定宪法的时候，就在美国的宪法当中，包含了很多就是权力制衡的方面。但是我发现现在美国的就是政治体制越来越倾向于权力的制衡，在政府的行政效率上面，我觉得他们现在效率已经是有一些比较低。比如说奥巴马他在选举的时候，他对选民做了很多的承诺，但是我发现他在4年的任期内，这些承诺兑现的进展是非常缓慢的。比如说，然后我就想问一下，就是美国的现行的政治体制，它有没有对这方面，就是提高效率这方面做出什么样改进？然后第二个问题是，我对中美未来的关系是非常关注的。然后第二个问题是，美国从中东和阿富汗，然后伊拉克收缩力量，美国就是现在是高调的表示要重返亚洲，主要是往东亚方面进行力量部署。昨天美国、日本和印度3国在新德里也召开了会议，虽然他们对外宣称不针对任何其他国家，但是他们也强调肯定会涉及到他们的议题，肯定会涉及到中国。那么您对美国重返亚洲战略，对遏制中国这个方面有没有一些什么看法？然后第3个问题是我个人的看法，就是从葡萄牙、西班牙建立世界霸主然后转移到英国，到最后他们转移到英国是通过战争。然后从英国转移到美国的时候是和平的让渡。我觉得未来一段时间，中国肯定会，中国的经济发展 然后各方面综合国力的发展可能会超过美国。然后，您觉得中国的崛起和美国想要保住它就是世界第一的位置，这之间会不会在未来有一个政治、经济或者是军事的冲突？谢谢。
谢谢。OK。我觉得你提这3个问题都提得很好，都是很大的问题，一个也可以讲1个小时、2个小时，这更不用说3个，所以我就尽量的就是比较简略的回答。关于第一个问题，我觉得你提到了一个很多美国人确实观察到的一个情况，就是美国的民主，并不是一个高效率的政治体制，它的好处是在其他的方面，它的好处是在就是充分的表达美国人民的意愿，在这个方面可以说是一个很好的制度。但是呢，从真正的做事情，或者是做长远的计划的这样的一个角度来讲，我们的制度我觉得在某一些方面的确有一些问题。我觉得其实你提的很对，你说的和观察的都很对。我们的效率在某一些方面并不是很高，这是一个问题，也是很多美国人开始关心的问题。我就举一个比较具体的例子，这个事情我还没有用中文谈过，所以我尽量的就是一个字一个字的翻译，然后看看有没有办法反应得过来。在美国参议院，你如果要做一件事情，要通过一个法案的话，有一个很重要的条例，就是结束辩论。为了结束辩论，你必须有60张票才可以结束辩论。所以也就是说，你必须有60个参议员同意，终于投票，才能够真正的处理这个事情。如果你只有59个人想这么做的话，但是没有60，你就永远没有办法处理这个法案，永远没有办法通过这个法案。所以这个呢，也不是一个宪法的问题，这个是一个参议院本身的一个游戏规则，一个条例。那么他们为了改变这个条例，你需要60个人同意做这个事情才行。所以很多人很愿意改变，但是没有办法找到那60个人的同意。所以这样的话呢，这个问题是一种就是没有办法解决的问题。那么这只不过是一个例子，但是也有一些其他的。我觉得现在美国的这个你说权力这个制衡是吧？对。权力制衡还不是主要的问题，这个不是美国行政部门和美国立法部门的问题，这是一个政治的问题。这个问题不是体制性的，这个问题是政治性的。那么这样呢，我觉得就涉及到另外一个问题，就是现在美国的政治越来越极端，就是共和党越来越右，民主党越来越左。那么中间的，就可以这么说吧，就是以前美国民主党的保守派和美国共和党的就是自由派中间的基本上是一样的，甚至于有一些美国的民主党的党员比共和党的党员还保守，有这样的情况。现在有一个很大的变化，就是中间呢，现在中间没有，也就是说最自由的最保守的民主党的和最自由的共和党中间还有很大的一块地。所以我觉得这是一个问题。那么这个问题真正的讨论就是它的来源，就是一个很说来话长的问题。但是重要的一点是你说的很对，我们这个效率不是很高。真正的解决，我觉得不会很容易。但是我觉得有一点是很多年的历史的一个很重要的教训。 或者是一个很重要的一个概念，就是一般来说，美国的政治家就是面临一个真正的挑战的时候，到了最后一个时刻会解决这个问题。但是呢，一般就是没有一个危机，我们就不解决。所以，一方面呢，这个让我有一种乐观的态度，但是另外一个方面让我有一种挫折感，因为就是到了一种危机的那种程度，事情的确没有办法这样继续下去的时候，我们才会有这样的终于会有这样的一个解决方案。所以这是第一个问题，我就没有一个很好的或者很令我满意的一个回答，因为你提这个问题是很对的，这个现在是美国的确所面临的一个非常严重的挑战。关于第二个问题，就是你说这个重返亚洲，也是一个很大的话题。我就长话短说吧，就是美国重返亚洲，实际上不是重返，因为我们从来没有离开过。对，所以我们就先说这一点，这是一个很重要的前提。那么第二点呢，就是这个重返亚洲呢，我个人的看法，我想大家可能感觉到我是一个很诚恳的人，可能因为我是德州人，我不知道，跟这个还是跟其他的事情有关系，我不知道。但是我是很诚，我可以很诚实的告诉你，我个人的看法，也不一定是所有的美国人的看法，也不一定是所有的中国人的看法。但是我觉得，美国所谓的回到亚洲来，或者到亚洲来，或者把重点从中东转到亚洲这样的一个行为，的确呢不是为了遏制中国，而是为了保护美国的合理的和合法的经济利益。只不过是这样。美国总统去年他宣布这个重要的政策的时候，这个政策转变的时候，他有这样的一种想法，而且他说得很清楚，他做了发表了一个重要讲话，在澳洲的那个国会，他就致辞说，实际上我们美国把太多的精力、太多的注意放在中东，已经太久了。但是中东呢，虽然重要，但是并不像亚洲地区这么重要。对美国的将来，对美国的经济将来，对美国的贸易，对美国的创造这个工作的机会、就业机会等等一系列。还有一点就是，如果从更长远的这样的一个立场来看的话，那么中东是很重要的，但是亚洲对美国来说也是很多美国人牺牲他们的生命的地方。第二次世界大战的时候，美国和中国也是站在一边的。第二次呢，就是朝鲜战争，就是也是一次很悲惨的事情。那么越南战争就也不用说了。所以这个地区呢，对于美国来讲是非常重要的。但是更重要的是，这个是历史。如果往前看的话，美国的利益是在亚洲，而中国也欢迎美国作为一个亚洲太平洋的国家。胡主席也说了这句话。那么，就是胡主席和美国总统就是发表了一个公报，说是美国欢迎一个就是越来越强大的、越来越成功的中国。那么中国也欢迎一个美国作为一个亚洲太平洋国家，就是确保安全的一系列的。在这一点上，中国和美国没有矛盾。所以我个人的看法是，这个不是为了遏制中国，而且主要不是一个军事的概念，主要是一个经济的概念。这是我个人的看法。有一些人不一定同意这个看法，但是这是我真心的一个想法。第三点呢，也是跟这个有关系的。你说就是中国正在崛起，正在就是越来越强大，越来越繁荣，在国际社会上扮演越来越重要的角色， 在这个区域也好，在这个世界上，很多问题就是没有中国的参与就没有办法解决。美国也是这样，没有美国的参与也没有办法解决，甚至于没有中美合作就没有办法解决。所以我经常这个让我想到另外一点，我经常说一句话，就是搞好中美关系，造福世界人民。我经常是这样看，所以我觉得世界还是很大。我觉得中国的这个很多年的崛起，就不会对美国呈现一个威胁，而且美国人并不会感觉到中国对于美国来讲是一个军事方面的威胁。所以我又强调我刚才谈的另外一个话题，就是在美国的总统辩论当中，或者美国的总统致辞当中呢，从来没有过，我说这一次大选从来没有过说中国军队这4个字，很有意思。如果真的美国感觉到中国好像中国的崛起对于美国来讲是一个巨大的威胁，我们要就是要讨论这个事情，那肯定要不然罗姆尼州长，要不然奥巴马总统，其中会有1个人，甚至于2个人都会谈这个问题，对不对？但是的确他们没有谈到，一次都没有谈到。中国军队，中国中国的解放军这些词都没有谈过，南海没有谈过，这个东海没有谈过，台湾没有谈过，等等等等。所以呢，我觉得你问的问题是很好，但是呢，我觉得在近期来讲，以我自己的看法来说，我觉得的确，现在我们就还不用过这个桥，可以这么说吧，就是我们还是有很多的时间，可以加强我们的双边关系，可以加强我们这个合作方式，也可以增进2个国家之间的互信，这是这样。Yes.
It's the last question.
Yeah, only got one question.
Okay.
This question just needed your comment. Several days ago, Chinese liberal Li Kangu published an article in Brookings Institute.
Yeah.
He's talking about mistrust between the United States and China.
Right. He wrote it with Wang Jisoo, right?
No, not one. The other guy. I don't know his English name.
He also wrote something with Wang Jisoo, but okay, tell me more.
Your friends. He's talking about there are mainly 4 obstacles in the mistrust issue. The first one is we have different values. The second is we have different interests. Third one is different approaches to the same interests. The fourth one is, we tend to misunderstand each other and, demonize each other. So at the same time, he's arguing that for the last 10 years, basically all the measures, taken to build the trust between the United States and China, to a certain degree, make people disappointed. So he's arguing that, for United States and China, we should interact. There is hardly any trust. We should interact with each other under distrust background. For this time, United States talking about the rebellion strategy. China is thinking you are messing up with China.
Yeah.
So what's your comment?
Well, first of all, let me say, Professor Lieberthal was kind enough to take part in one of our delegations earlier this year. So in April, I had the opportunity, and for me, it was a privilege to spend a week with him in a small group here in Beijing, working on some of these issues and having good meetings and discussions. And we talked quite a bit about the strategic trust issue. And he raised an interesting question that I think was in his paper, or in one of his previous papers, and that is, the United States and China have been interacting with each other and dealing with each other to a greater degree than ever before in history. And yet, and this is Kenneth Lieberthal who said this, and yet, the fact is, we trust each other less today than we ever have. That's what he said. And so he asked a rhetorical question. He said, why is that? And I actually said to Professor Lieberthal, I said, well, I have a theory on that. And I said, I think it's because we never really deal with the core issues of mistrust in the relationship. So let me tell you what I think are the 6 levels of mistrust. Levels of mistrust that we actually never really deal with, and that's why we don't get any better, despite our best efforts. Number 1, starting from the most fundamental and going up from the fundamental root causes, culture and civilization. Now what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you all 6 and then I'll tell you a few words about each. I won't take long. So culture and civilization. Next level, ideology. Because ideology in some ways stems from the deeper sources of culture and civilization. From ideology we then get foreign policy doctrine, which is basically the foreign policy grand strategy of a nation. From there we get specific national interests. And then from interests we get different tactics and styles. And then from there we have one last level, number 6, which is what I call discursive method. It means how we talk about foreign policy. We sometimes use words that cause misunderstanding even when we don't realize it. And so what I said was, just a word or two on each. I'll give you an example. At the level of deep culture and civilization, there's a very important difference between the United States and China. People don't talk about it. I think, as far as I know, I'm the only one who's raised this. And I raised it in some speeches that I've done over the last couple of years. In fact, I think I first mentioned it publicly in December of 2009 at a talk I did at the University of Washington called Vigilant Partners, the Sources and Consequences of Mistrust in U.S. China Relations. And at the level of culture and civilization, the United States and China have an enormous difference, more than one. But one that I'll highlight here is both cultures have a concept of dualism, kind of not to be too philosophical, but dualism. But our concepts of dualism are very, very different. In the United States, our concept of dualism is good versus evil, and one is better than the other. And in very simple terms, China's concept of dualism is yin and yang. One is not better than the other, but you have to have both to survive. So America tends to see the world through the prism of good and evil. And this comes from our religious tradition, our Judeo-Christian heritage, where we see the world as black or white, good or evil, day or night. You're with us or you're against us. There's no in between. But China sees the world fundamentally in a different way. I'm okay, you're okay. Leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. I mind my business, you mind your business. What I do is my problem, what you do is your problem. You respect me, I respect you. Balance. That's the dualism of China. So our dualisms are completely antithetical to each other. I'm not saying one is better than the other, per se. What I'm saying is that they're not very compatible. And so at a very profound level of culture and civilization, at the most basic level that we never even think about, we have problems that we don't even know about. So, for example, during the Iraq War period, when President Bush was president, and he said, you're either with us or against us, that was coming from a place of deep American and Western civilization. There's no way for us to change that. And I don't think there's any way for China to come and look at the world through that lens. China has its own way. And so what I'm saying is, going back to Ken Lieberthal's question, why do we not seem to be progressing, even though we have the strategic economic dialogue and 90 other bilateral dialogue mechanisms that are out there? Why aren't we getting better? Because we never really deal with the root causes, and we never even understand them. That's one example. I could give you quite a few others. With respect to ideology, that's obvious. With respect to foreign policy doctrine, we have some doctrinal differences. China believes, among other things, in non-aggression. The United States doesn't always believe in non-aggression. So at a doctrinal level, we have a problem. So when we look at doing something in Iraq, or before that in Kuwait, or in Afghanistan, or in Libya, or anywhere else, China has a real issue with aggression because it values sovereignty to a very high degree. And China has a real issue with, quote, as you mentioned, interference in the internal affairs of another country.
Peaceful coexistence.
They're the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Mutual respect and benefit. Exactly. The 5th one is peaceful coexistence. It's these ideas of how we get along with each other in the world. Peaceful coexistence. The United States doesn't always embrace peaceful coexistence. We sometimes make other choices. We sometimes feel that we have to use military methods to achieve our national interests. I'm not judging that. I'm just saying that's different from China, so we have doctrinal differences. I'll come back to you in a second. But that's doctrine. National interests, we have many interests that are in common, but we have some interests that are not so much in common. For example, the United States feels that it has an interest in selling arms to Taiwan. China believes that the U.S. selling arms to Taiwan is very much not in China's interest. So we have a conflict of interest over that issue. We have a conflict of interest to a degree perhaps over Syria, although that's much more removed from China. But Syria is a case where China, along with Russia, has consistently vetoed in the United Nations efforts to move forward to resolve the problem. I'm not judging it, I'm just saying it's different. And so that's at the level of national interest. Style. We sometimes have the same interest, but we have very different ideas about how to achieve it. North Korea. The United States wants a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. China wants a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. How do we get there? We have absolutely different views. The United States believes in one style of diplomacy, China believes in another, and the bottom line is the problem is not solved. It's getting worse. And then finally, discursive methods. Sometimes we talk in a way that causes problems and causes misunderstanding and mistrust. You know, one thing the Chinese often say, it's an example of how language matters. When something bad happens, the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman will often say, "This hurts the feelings of the Chinese people." Right? That's weird from an American standpoint. It's just strange. I mean, we're not talking about Valentine's Day and high school dances. That doesn't make sense to an American. We don't. This is not about feelings. This is about interests. This is not personal. It's business. And it's okay. If you disagree with us, that's fine. We sometimes disagree with you. No problem. But what I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying we don't understand that. It's a way of talking that doesn't make any sense to the American people. Have you ever heard a U.S. president say, "You've hurt the feelings"? Your reaction is, it makes the point. It's ridiculous. We wouldn't talk that way. But that's fine. It's just a different way of communicating. And it's a different way of expressing. And it's one where you sometimes get a scenario where you're saying something, but we're missing it because you're not using language that makes sense to us. And sometimes we don't use language that makes sense to you. So I'm not saying one is better or worse. I'm just saying from an American perspective, it's strange. So these are all the ways that mistrust and misunderstanding are generated. And we don't talk about any of it. I do. But most of us don't because we're focused on the national interest. North Korea, Iran. But above that and below that, there's many forces at work that generate a lot of mistrust. And I think all of us have an opportunity and a responsibility to work together and to work with each other toward the objective and the goal of a more productive U.S. China relationship that benefits both of our countries. So with that, it's 9:10. I really appreciate your time. It's been a privilege and an honor. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Hey, thank you. Really appreciate it.
关了啊。 咱那个插座也薄啊，那个充电。